celebrating 4 decades in showbiz with a...
They used to laugh with him, then they laughed at him. And then they simply stopped laughing altogether. For years, Bob Downe was everywhere. The dazzling teeth, the polyester suits, the cheesy smile, and that unmistakably flamboyant charm turned him into a household name in Australia. But behind the shimmering camp facade was Mark Trevorrow, a man navigating fame, queerness, and the cruel pendulum swing of public acceptance. Few remember the precise moment it shifted, but suddenly the applause faded. Invitations dwindled. And Bob Downe, once the golden boy of Australian comedy, became a ghost on television screens. What really happened? Was it the saturation of the character? Or something deeper, more unsettling? Something unspoken in the industry corridors and whispered in green rooms? He was one of the first openly gay entertainers in Australia, and with that courage came a price. There were jokes about him being too gay, producers who wouldn't touch the character, and critics who dismissed his brand of comedy as outdated or offensive. But why was flamboyance charming one year and repulsive the next? And how much of that rejection was rooted in Trevorrow's refusal to closet himself in a time when the entertainment world still demanded silence? Before the world could celebrate authenticity, it punished those who embodied it too loudly. Mark Trevorrow became both pioneer and pariah in the same breath. This is the story of how one of Australia's most iconic comedic voices, loud, glittery, and unapologetically queer, went from national treasure to national afterthought. But behind the jokes lies a darker, more painful truth. And once it's revealed, you may never see that cheesy smile the same way again. In the mid-1980s, Australia was undergoing a cultural shift. The country's media was bursting with local color, glitzy game shows, variety programs, and a growing appetite for uniquely Australian comedy. Amid this scene stepped a figure unlike any other, Bob Downe. With his high-waisted slacks, safari suits, blinding smile, and over-the-top cabaret stylings, he was both a parody and a product of the era. But Bob Downe wasn't real. He was the creation, and in many ways, the alter ego of journalist-turned-performer Mark Trevorrow. Mark had started out in newspapers, working as a music journalist, but it was on stage that he found his true voice, or rather, a wildly exaggerated version of it. Inspired by 70s lounge singers and kitsch entertainment, Bob Downe was flamboyant, tacky, and hilariously self-aware. Audiences loved him. He was so confidently ridiculous that it felt like liberation. For some, it was a harmless laugh. For others, especially those in the LGBTQ+ community, it was something more. A coded celebration of queerness on national television. Bob Downe became a regular on TV screens, especially on Good Morning Australia and comedy festivals across the country. He was camp, outrageous, and undeniably queer-coded, a reflection of the man behind the act. But Mark Trevorrow was never just playing a character. He was living his truth in a world not quite ready for it. As the 90s rolled in, and Australia became more self-conscious about image, inclusivity, and political correctness, what was once celebrated as camp slowly began to be viewed as too much. People began asking, was Bob Downe a clever satire or an uncomfortable stereotype? Trevorrow, who had always lived openly as a gay man, found himself caught in a cultural shift that punished the very honesty he'd championed. As new voices emerged, more palatable, less threatening, more mainstream friendly, the industry that once celebrated him began to distance itself. He wasn't being censored outright. He was being quietly erased. Yet, Bob Downe wasn't just a character. He had become a landmark. His flamboyant presence on Australian stages and screens was a form of resistance in its own way. Long before there were rainbow flags on corporate logos or pride specials on every channel, there was Mark Trevorrow in polyester, with a microphone, pushing boundaries that many didn't even know were there. But what happened when that boundary pushing went too far for the gatekeepers? What happens when being too visible becomes a liability? It started with a laugh and a wig. Mark Trevorrow wasn't supposed to become Bob Downe. In the early 1980s, he was a young journalist with a sharp wit, writing for Melbourne's Nation Review. But the newsroom couldn't contain his theatrical energy. A chance performance in a cabaret act with Kathy Armstrong led to the birth of a character that would consume the next 2 decades of his life. Bob Downe appeared almost accidentally in 1984 as part of their double act, but soon the polyester-clad crooner eclipsed everything else. By 1987, Trevorrow had gone solo, and Bob Downe was no longer just a character. He was an institution. Bob's aesthetic was unmistakable. Slick-back blonde hair, over-enunciated vowels, a voice permanently stuck in a cheesy TV presenter mode. His performances were equal parts lounge act, parody, and cultural commentary. He would belt out pop hits from the 70s with comic conviction, sprinkle in absurd monologues, and beam at the audience with exaggerated charm. Underneath the glitz was a biting satire of Australian media culture, especially its obsession with wholesome masculinity, and the public adored him. He became a staple at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival, where he was dubbed the Prince of Polyester. His shows sold out across the UK and Edinburgh, where British audiences were enchanted by the absurdity of this sunburned, hyper-Aussie lounge singer from the Gold Coast. In 1993, he was even nominated for a Perrier Award, one of comedy's highest honors. In Australia, he became a TV darling. Bob Downe appeared regularly on Channel 10, especially on Good Morning Australia with Bert Newton. He was everywhere: morning shows, panel programs, late-night variety hours. The character was so pervasive, so fully formed, that many viewers weren't even sure if Bob Downe was real. Some believed he was just an eccentric entertainer from Queensland. Others assumed he was straight. That ambiguity gave Trevorrow a strange kind of power. He was hiding in plain sight. Then came the turning point. In the mid-90s, as discussions about representation and identity sharpened, Mark Trevorrow publicly came out as gay. It was a moment of pride for him, but also one that subtly altered the industry's gaze. Suddenly, Bob Downe was no longer just a quirky character. He was seen, uncomfortably by some, as a man embodying his queerness too loudly, too unapologetically, and too often. His jokes, once embraced as clever parody, were now criticized as stereotypes. The industry, always cautious about brand safety, began to retreat. Producers stopped calling. Shows stopped booking. Headlines shifted tone, from glowing praise to quiet dismissals. Critics began labeling the act as dated, and Trevorrow, once the toast of Australian comedy, found himself increasingly out of step with the mainstream. In truth, nothing had changed about Bob Downe, but everything had changed around him. It wasn't a scandal in the traditional sense. No criminal charges, no lawsuits, no explosive tabloid story. It was worse in a way. It was erasure by silence. Slowly, subtly, the character who once sang across national airwaves became a side act, a curiosity, a relic of another time. But Mark didn't stop performing. He continued to tour, especially in the UK and at gay cabaret events in Australia. He embraced his community even more fiercely. Yet the bitterness of the rejection lingered. What had once been embraced as groundbreaking was now shelved. Bob Downe, the man who had made Australia laugh at itself, was no longer invited to the stage. But why? Why did the curtain fall so abruptly on a character who had once been beloved, and who decided when it was too much? There was no public memo, no cancellation notice, no scandalous headline. But behind the scenes, the message became clear. Bob Downe was no longer welcome in mainstream Australian media. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was insidious. Invitations to primetime panels dried up. Producers who once fought to book him were suddenly unavailable. Shows that once hailed him as a national treasure now labeled the act as niche, tired, or too gay for general audiences. It wasn't the character who had changed. It was the country's appetite for queerness that had turned cautious, even hostile. Mark Trevorrow would later describe this period as a slow, choking kind of exile. In interviews, he hinted at the real emotional cost, how the industry that had once embraced him now tiptoed around him like he was a liability. "I didn't become less funny," he once said. "I became less comfortable for them." The camp that had once delighted morning show hosts now made them fidget. His queerness, no longer ambiguous, no longer wrapped in satire, was viewed as a threat to the imagined neutrality of Australian entertainment. There were whispers in media circles. Some said he had overplayed his hand, that Bob Downe had become too political, too flamboyant, too out. But what they really meant was too honest. Mark had pulled the mask off the character, and in doing so, revealed a country still deeply uncomfortable with visible queerness. The laughter stopped, not because the jokes changed, but because the illusion of safety did. Even within the LGBTQ+ community, the response was mixed. While many saw Bob Downe as a pioneering symbol of visibility, others criticized the character for reinforcing stereotypes. It was a cruel paradox. He was attacked for being too gay by the mainstream and too caricatured by progressives. Mark was caught in the middle, trying to survive as both entertainer and human being. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, Trevorrow slipped into a kind of cultural invisibility. He kept performing at fringe festivals, in cabaret rooms, and at pride events, but the media never called back. The silence was loud. It echoed in every unreturned email, every awkward brush-off, every slot given to newer, safer acts. And for a performer who had once commanded thousands, the descent was not just professional, it was deeply personal. The man behind the teeth and tuxedo went through a quiet emotional reckoning. Friends recall how he became more withdrawn. It was like watching someone vanish in slow motion, one close colleague said. He'd walk into a room and people would avoid eye contact, not because they hated him, but because they didn't know what to do with him anymore. The press didn't cover his absence because they didn't even notice it. The entertainment machine had moved on, and Trevorrow was left standing still, clinging to a persona that once defined a generation, but now felt like a ghost in polyester. Yet, despite the rejection, he refused to kill Bob Downe. He continued to bring him to life for niche audiences who remembered, who cared. In queer spaces, he became something more than a performer. He became an icon of resilience. His shows still drew laughs, still sparkled, but now there was something heavier behind the eyes. A private pain carried beneath every smile, every joke, every high note. And slowly, the narrative began to change again. In recent years, as Australia has revisited its cultural history with new sensitivity and understanding, voices have begun to ask, did we abandon Bob Downe too quickly? Did we exile Mark Trevorrow for daring to be himself? Looking back, the answer feels painfully clear. He wasn't erased for being irrelevant. He was erased for being ahead of his time. At Aussie Uncovered, we believe stories like Mark Trevorrow's aren't just about fame or failure. They're about timing, truth, and the emotional cost of authenticity in a world that only celebrates it when it's convenient. Mark Trevorrow didn't just invent a character. He created a mirror, a glittering, absurd, and wildly entertaining mirror that reflected Australia's own discomfort with camp, queerness, and flamboyant joy. Bob Downe was never about making fun of gay men. He was about celebrating the glorious ridiculousness of performative masculinity, of television culture, of the very idea of what makes someone safe enough to be on screen. But in being too honest, too obviously gay, too unwilling to tone it down, Mark crossed an invisible line. He didn't self-destruct. He didn't have a scandal. He simply became a risk. That's what makes his story so disturbing. Trevorrow was dropped, not because he failed to evolve, but because the industry failed to evolve with him. And when the wave of progress finally did arrive, when queerness became marketable, commodified, even trendy, he was rarely included in the celebration. Others stood in the spotlight he had helped build, while he watched from the wings. And still, he never stopped performing. There's a particular kind of strength in that. It's not the dramatic redemption arc of a fallen star. It's quieter, more painful, and infinitely more human. Mark Trevorrow chose to keep laughing. He kept Bob alive, not for the industry that shunned him, but for the audiences who still saw themselves in the sparkle, in the voice, in the joke that landed just a little too hard. To us, that makes him more than a comedian. It makes him a cultural survivor. We invite you, the audience, to look again at the polyester suits and the blinding smile, not with irony, but with recognition. Behind that smile is a man who paved the way for many who came after, and who paid a very real price for being first, loudest, and proudest. Was he too much, or were we just not ready? And now that we are, do we owe him more than silence? Somewhere, in a small cabaret room or on a fringe stage, Bob Downe still steps out from behind the curtain. The lights hit his golden suit, the grin flashes, the voice, part satire, part sincerity, rings out over the crowd. And in that moment, for those who remember, it feels like 1993 again. But there's something different now. The laughter is softer, warmer. It's not just at the jokes, it's in recognition of a performer who never stopped, of a character who refused to die, of a man who turned polyester into protest and show tunes into survival. Mark Trevorrow never begged for a comeback. He never needed one. Because the truth is, He never really left. He was simply shifted into the shadows, left waiting while the world caught up to the light he carried long before it was fashionable. There are many stories in entertainment history of stars who faded, but few tell the quieter truth of those who were dimmed on purpose simply because they shined too honestly. Bob Downe was never too much. He was just enough for those who saw beyond the camp and into the courage. Today, we remember him not as a novelty act, but as a pioneer. Not just for the queer community, but for every artist who dared to be both a character and a confession. Some stories are never told, but now you know. And maybe the next time you hear that familiar cheesy medley and see that blinding smile, you'll feel something more than nostalgia. You'll feel recognition and a quiet kind of reverence for the man who made the country laugh, even when it forgot how to laugh with him.